look into an important current affairs that is related to the topic cardiac stent. Now before we move on to the issue as such, first of all we look into what exactly is this cardiac stent. Now for that you need to analyze a situation wherein the coronary artery of a person gets narrowed due to the deposition of fats. Now what happens when there is a deposition of the fats? It can lead to reduced blood flow and this can result in extreme cases to heart attack. So it is here that we make use of what is called as a cardiac stent, and cardiac stent is a very tiny wire mesh tube, and this is inserted to the narrowed coronary artery, and this stent keeps the artery open. So this is why we make use of the cardiac stent. Now when you analyze or look into the various cases of cardiovascular diseases in India, it is rising, and in specifically when you look into the patients who are undergoing the treatment for the heart attack, that is what the treatment is known as angioplast, the number of patients who are undergoing this process of this treatment angioplast is increasing, and in the past 5 years you can say that it has almost doubled. So but the problem with this angioplast is that it's very expensive, and the major component that contributes to this high price of this treatment of angioplast is the price of the cardiac stent. Now, so that there was a huge demand to the government that there needs to be a regulation to the price of the cardiac stent, and as per this demand, government decided to bring in certain regulation. Now, how did the government bring about the regulation? In 2016, government included the cardiac stent in the national list of essential medicines, and then the stents were included in 2016 itself. The stents were included in the first list of the drugs price control orders. And then in 2017, the NPPA, or what are called as the National Pharmaceutical Pricing Authority, which is a drug regulator, slashed the price of the stents by around 85%. Now, as per the regulated price, the bare metal stent, which earlier used to cost about 45,000, has been now made available for rupees 7,623, and the drug eluting stent, which is earlier about 1.21 lakh, now it has reduced to about 31,080. So this is actually the current affairs. Now, what are the implications with this particular regulation? First thing is in regard to the addressing of the huge unethical markups. In case of stent, massive margins are being charged when at the each and every stages of the step of this distribution as well as supply of the stent, and by the time it reaches the consumers, it is about 1000 to 2000% higher than that of the original cost of the stent. So by addressing or bringing in the regulation, the government has been able to address the huge unethical markup that earlier existed. And second, it has made the stents more accessible to those patients who really need them. Earlier it was expensive and that was not accessible to most of them, and now it has been made more accessible. And then it has helped in addressing the irrational use of the technologies, and it has disincentivized the hospitals to make use of certain expensive treatment like that, the angioplast, needlessly. And then it has also increased the use of the indigenously manufactured stents. Now how it is going to benefit the use of the indigenously manufactured stent? Because with the regulation, what has happened is that there has been threatening by the international manufacturers that they will be withdrawing from the Indian market. Now if such kind of thing happens, it can act as a boost for the indigenous manufacturers. So these are the various advantages with this particular regulation. That is, the first thing is the addressing of the huge unethical markup. Second, making stent more accessible to the people who really need them. And third, it is to address the irrational use of medical technologies that usually exist. And then it can also increase the use of the indigenously manufactured stent. But there are also negatives. Now what are those negatives? Now, the first thing is in regard to the reducing of the supply of the medical devices. Now earlier what has happened is that the manufacturers were assured of certain amount of return, but now with the regulation, that return has declined, and that can result in reducing the supply of the medical devices, and it can also deter the companies from introducing the newer generation stents. Now that is one of the negatives, and then it also puts a bad light on doing business in India. How? Now with the regulation, what has happened is that I have already mentioned international companies that are threatening that they will exit the Indian market, and certain companies have also submitted their withdrawal request to the NPPA, which is a drug regulator, but the NPPA has refused to give in the withdrawal, and that has resulted, or that has put in a bad light on the doing business in India. And then it is also affecting the research on indigenous stents. Now, how is this research going to get affected? Now, with this particular price regulation, the price of the imported as well as the indigenous stents have turned out to be the same. So, in the case that the cost is the same, which one will be preferred? Is it the imported or the indigenous? Imported. So, in that this particular case will disincentivize the Indian manufacturers from doing the quality research, and this can also ultimately result in the country now turning out to be dependent on the imported stents. So, that is the research on indigenous stents, which can ultimately make the country dependent on the imported stent. And then also there is another negative implication. Now, what happens, the stenting process has now turned out to be less expensive. So, what happens is that most often the ill-informed patients can opt for this multi-stenting rather than going for the open heart surgery, which is preferred in cases of multiple blocks. So, that is another negative implication of this particular move. So, when you look into the negative implications, once again, it can reduce the supply of the medical devices, it can put a bad light on doing business in India and affect even the medical tourism, and then it can deter the companies from selling the newer generation stents, and it will also affect the research on the indigenous stents, and also can result in the preference for the stenting process and over the open heart surgery. So, these are the various negatives. So, what are the recent developments in regard to the price regulation? First of all, it's the NPPA that has issued the demand notices to the hospitals, and which have claimed to be charging more than the decided price. So, the NPPA has issued the demand notice, and then it has also reduced the price of orthopedic knee implant. That is, earlier the cobalt chromium knee implant was available at 1.5 lakh. Now it is available at 54,720, and similarly implants with a special metal, earlier it was 4.5 lakh and now it's 76,600. So that is in regard to the recent developments. But when you look into the effectiveness of this particular price regulation, you can say that even after 7 months that after this price regulation was brought in, the process or the treatment of angioplasty cost, it remains the same. Now, why it remains the same? Even though the stent price got reduced, the hospital started increasing the cost of other components that is required for this particular angioplasty treatment, and also the hospital expenses also started they raised the hospital expenses. So that in effect has neutralized the benefits that were intended to be passed to the patients as per the price regulation. So with regard to the effectiveness, we can say that the benefits got neutralized because the cost of the other components was raised or was hiked, and that neutralized. So when you look into what exactly is the way forward, so looking into the suggestions that can be made, first of all, to address the cases of the cost of other components getting hiked, we need to bring in more transparency in the billing process. That's the first thing. Second thing is that government needs to consider the suggestion of bringing a standardized cost for certain basic treatments that can bring in a uniformity in different hospitals in regard to that basic treatments. And the government again should encourage the Indian stent manufacturers and also invest more in the medical device research. Now, the government should also consider this particular regulation and the after effects as a case in which the Make in India initiative can be boosted with respect to the medical devices. So these are the way forward, and along with it, you can say that the government needs to look beyond price regulation. It's not just by the price regulation that the health system or the healthcare system can be totally changed, but we need to do more. For that, you need to analyze the present healthcare system. It is underfinanced as well as it lacks many of the basic infrastructure in terms of the doctors, in terms of the number of the beds. It's comparatively less, or it is underfinanced as well as the infrastructure facility is not adequate. So that requires the healthcare financing as well as the non-financing measures. Now, what do you mean by this healthcare financing? It means that the government needs to invest more on the health sector. Now, the recent National Health Policy of 2017, which aims to make the expenditure to about 2.5% of the GDP, is a welcome step. But when you compare with the international standards, which is about 5 to 6% of the GDP, it's comparatively less. So the government needs to invest more on the health sector. And in regard to the non-financing measures, it mainly includes the making up of the procurement mechanism. For instance, we need to fix in the supply chain that has resulted in the shortage of the vaccines in certain states, and it also means to address the supply shortages that is in regard to certain equipments that has resulted in the cases of Gorakhpur incidents. So such kind of measures need to be taken. That is, it requires the healthcare financing as well as the non-financing measures. And when this healthcare system is taken up or considered in a holistic manner, and both the healthcare as well as the non-financing measures are being taken up, then only can the universal quality healthcare be ensured. Now this is essential for the attainment of the sustainable development goals, and is also also essential for the attainment of the 3-year agenda that was recently put forward by the Niti Aayog. So these are the main things in regard to the cardiac stent and the price regulation. So look into the different aspects. So that is enough.